Have you ever woken up from a dream only to forget it a few moments later? Well, now a Japanese laboratory is developing a machine that's the first step in, believe it or not, recording dreams.
Japanese scientists have created the first step toward a device that, by scanning people's brains, could record people's dreams and read their mind. A science lab in Kyoto, Japan, has developed a system of using MRI scanners to resolve images directly from subjects' brains. The current experiments show a subject an image and then reconstruct that image based on scans of the brain's visual cortex. The team calibrated a computer program by scanning volunteers staring at hundreds of different still images in black, white, and gray. Then, the computer program reproduces the figures and letters that the volunteers had seen, albeit more blurry than the originals. The next step for researchers will be to study how to visualize images inside people's minds that have not been presented before, a technology that could make it possible to record people's dreams.
Although it's somewhat science fiction-like, for example, if you're 50 years old and see a really good dream the day before, you could scan that and show it to your kids.
Researchers say the brain-reading technology would also open the way for people to communicate directly from their mind or control electronic devices without using their bodies, making keyboards and buttons a thing of the past.
Although there are many forms of communication, such as the internet, all of them are limited by the body. However, this means that we have a method of communication that can interface directly with the brain.
While the new technology opens the door to many new possibilities, scientists warn that it could bring about new issues concerning ethics and privacy, meaning that for those wanting to plug themselves in, they might have to wait a bit longer.
Welcome, how's it going? I hope that you're doing well. And today we're going to get into this idea of the psychology of dreams. I hope that beginning worked okay. I tried to put a little bit of music on that first slide, and I'm a little bit nervous that there was a little bit of a dead time at the end there, so I apologize if there was. But anyways, grab a coffee, hope you're doing well, and let's get into the psychology of dreams. This should be hopefully a fun one. So difficult is it to understand a dream that for a long time I've made it a rule. When someone tells me a dream and asks for my opinion, to say first of all to myself, I have no idea what this dream means. After that, I can begin to examine the dream. I think that's a cool quote from Jung, because Jung was one of the deepest thinkers in the history of psychology, and really struggled with this question. And one of the great books by Jung is this one called Memories, Dreams, and Reflections. And he talks a lot about dreams, and he talked a lot about interpretation of dreams, and in a lot of ways he's one of the most famous foundational voices on this. And even he is saying that although there's a significant symbolic meaning in some dreams sometimes, that we have to begin by acknowledging the mystery. And that it's so interesting that even in 2021, there's so much that we don't understand about dreams. And we're going to talk today about some of the neuroscience around it, and we're going to talk about different understandings of it. And I'm going to focus a little bit today on some kind of psychoanalytic ways of looking at it from both a Freudian and a Jungian perspective. And I started this with that video, right, of what's it going to mean in 15 years or in 5 years or in 2 years if you can record your dreams? And what if you can watch your own dreams? And what if you can watch your boyfriend or girlfriend or spouse's dreams? And what if you can probably see where the spiral of ethics could go? What if your employer could watch your dreams? What if your government could? What if you could record your dreams? That obviously means you're somehow mapping the visual cortex. And if I can map your visual cortex, theoretically I could do that when you were awake too. So we're going to get to these questions technologically before we've developed the ethical philosophy almost is my concern. Welcome. Love this class. Let's keep going here. I dreamed I was a butterfly, flying in the sky. Then I awoke. Now I wonder, am I a man who dreamt of being a butterfly? Or am I a butterfly dreaming that I'm a man? I thought you'd find this kind of neat because I'm just trying to show this idea that today we're going to be talking about attempts to try to understand this complexity of dreams, like the fact that you lay down at night and close your eyes and have these completely immersive hallucinations that are completely HD, 180p, 4K, whatever you want to say. They're highly personalized sometimes. Sometimes they're completely random. And then you forget almost all of it. That's been something that our ancestors have been trying to figure out and struggle with. And is there a religious purpose? Are these visions? Are these nonsense? Did you eat too much cheese? That was actually what people thought for a long time, and digestion does influence dreaming, so there's something to that. And so the point I'm trying to make here with Zhang, who's like the sort of second most famous Taoist philosopher after Lao Tzu, he's sort of number 2. It's interesting that this image that I am using here is, they refer to him as the Tao Dream Master, which is a pretty cool job title. I would call him like a Taoist philosopher, but he was a little more. You could make the connection, like if Lao Tzu is is Socrates, Zhang is Plato, a little more focused on, well, stuff like this, like the consciousness and dreams and metaphysics and philosophical. And what he's capturing in this poem is this idea of how we've all had these dreams that are fantastic and feel so real, or sometimes they're unbelievable and amazing, or sometimes they're bitter and filled with pain. But the realness, right? It's like, it felt so real to Zhang that he's asking, like, do I have this actually maybe flipped? And it's this questioning. All right, you guys are like, can you finish this slide? But I think that that's an interesting point, that our ancestors always have been, since they've been talking, have been struggling with this, and since even before that, they were probably, why are we having this? If it didn't serve a purpose, we would have evolved away from it long ago. Nature is ruthless, right? Think about it from this angle too. For you to sleep, you got to be laying on your back, let's say for a third of the day, say 8 hours, we'll just say roughly a third of the day. And you're laying down in this highly vulnerable position for a mammal. Unconscious. Susceptibility to threat at an incredible height. Yes, we're going to talk all about this idea of why we dream, what evolutionary roots to it, what they might mean. Is it just brain activity? Is it highly symbolic? Is it some combination of both? So I like using this image because even though it's obviously kind of general, but it shows this concept that a lot of things are going on in your brain at the same time when you're sleeping. And how this, obviously understanding sleep and understanding dreaming as a component of sleep, this highly cognitively charged component of sleep, that your brain orchestrates this daily sleep-wake cycle, like sleep and awake, by responding to external cues such as sunlight, the body's own rhythms, right? Which is obviously also why a lot of you probably obviously already know this, but like why reading a lot on your phone right before bed interferes with your sleep, because it tricks your brain into thinking that it's seeing real sunlight from the blue light, which affects your melatonin centers, right? So that's why like having a blue light filter on your phone is a smart idea. It's actually a biological understanding. Levels of hormones rise and fall in key parts of the brain to generate feelings of sleepiness and wakefulness, and these fluctuations of hormones differ in brains of different ages, right? Which is one of the reasons why, for example, infants need a lot of sleep, and so do actually teenagers, comparative to other groups. Scientists are unsure about why we need sleep, although it seems to play a vital role in memory storage and in information processing. So, and here's one of the interesting things I want to kind of touch on a bunch of times is we know also that depriving sleep and depriving dreams specifically can have this, well, has this massively detrimental cognitive effect. I'm going to talk about that in detail later. Right, so the thalamus is cutting off signals during sleep. We got the cerebellum that's exerting this muscle control that's active during REM sleep. So when you're deep in dream, you're not flailing all over the place, although sometimes people have issues with that, and we'll talk about that too, where they're, and that can be actually really troubling for both them and if they have like a partner that they share the bed with, because oftentimes they can't, because or they have to do certain things because they have like a tendency to flail arms and all that kind of stuff, act out their dreams basically. The amygdala, the emotional center that is so core to regulating emotion and especially things like mood, is highly sensitive to sleep deprivation. Sorry, I know my camera is kind of covering a bit, but what that says there is that sensitive to sleep deprivation, which is why you get cranky when you haven't slept enough. You know, I get guilty of that too, big time. It's like when you're well rested, something that really stressed you out and felt overwhelming when you were not well rested can oftentimes feel much more manageable. And it's actually because your brain's processing it differently. It doesn't seem like as much of a threat when you're rested. Your hypothalamus controls the body's cardiac rhythms. So again, core to these kind of central biorhythms. The hippocampus, where memories are being transferred for long and short-term memory, is highly active during sleep. So it seems that sleep and dreaming is deeply connected with the memory formation process, which is like, we're going to spend more time on that. That's a central piece. And then the prefrontal cortex, which I'm going to kind of touch on in an interesting way when we talk about lucid dreaming a bit later, and how that is oftentimes, how that activation of that is related to lucid dreaming. Right? Because the prefrontal cortex is that decision-making part. So it's like what lucid dreaming, we're going to get into what it is basically, is knowing that you're dreaming while you're dreaming and being able to start to exert control over your dream. So now think about the idea that when people that are lucid dreaming, we see less restriction in the prefrontal cortex, so that's actually being more involved. I'm going to show you some interesting research on that in a little bit, but yeah, so there's a lot of underlying brain functioning and processing that we're going to be looking at. But then I also want to not just do that. I want to not just do a highly kind of biopsych view of dreams, although I want that to be like kind of half of it. The other half, I want to take a deep kind of psychoanalytic look at what the actual content of dreams might represent. Let's do this. So people ask the question, right? Like, what is a dream? Is it just brain activity? Right, like activity synthesis theory, which is a good term to have, but because it's basically saying, like, is it just your brain is doing all these cognitive processes, and as a result of that activity, your brain's trying to make sense of it while you're in sleep, and it's just kind of a byproduct of that. The dream is sort of a secondary phenomena. Epiphenomena is a word that is a cool word. It's like epiphenomena means like a secondary phenomena. Like without the dream would be actually a great example of that if this idea is true, because it's like your brain is just like processing all the information of the day. Your consciousness experiences that, or not your dreaming mind experiences that as this visual experience. Is that what a dream is? Is it that your brain engages in a lot of random neural activity and your dream is trying to make sense of that activity? I think that there's a piece to this, right? And I think that I'm going to really try today to kind of base this whole discussion in the idea that the mystery of dreams is cool still. And it's cool because, or is one of the last kind of, not even last, but one of the major frontiers in psychology still. Because it's fascinating in any way. Like it's say let's go extreme one way, and dreams are almost visionary level, important, significant. That's fascinating. If dreams were completely meaningless and random, the fact that we still do that would be fascinating. If it's some combination that's exactly 50-50, that'd be fascinating. If it's more this way, right? So if you let your mind kind of just open up to this idea that it is really interesting that for roughly 2 hours a day, you're having a hallucinatory experience that is highly contextualized to your own life, that you remember almost none of. And that every other human being does too. Everyone, not everyone. And I'm going to talk about that in a little bit, but because there's a few exceptions in some very specific situations. Yeah, so is it just brain activity? That's this one. So a really fascinating thing about research into REM sleep is that infants dream not only a higher percentage of their sleep time, but they get to REM quicker, right? So if you were to compare them to like how an adult sleeps, the baby gets into a REM sleep cycle almost right away. It's so you've heard me maybe throughout this course make that suggests the idea that a baby's mind and a dreaming mind have similarities. And that's kind of a thing I've just been kind of thinking about lately. I don't mean that too literally, but I mean that at a kind of abstract level. And maybe that's behind this kind of idea that at some level, sleep and dreaming, then being awake and experiencing at the sensory motor level, right, which is Piaget's idea about the first 2 years of life. And then you go to sleep at night and it's synthesized, but in this way that's like related to cognitive development and maturation, like the maturation of the brain, that it's deeply embedded in this processing, in this development of the mind, of your psychology, of you, that the dream is a piece of the processing cycle, right? And that would, at least an argument for that would be that it exists at all, right? So having evolutionary importance makes more sense than not. It makes more sense at a certain level that it would be meaningful than it wouldn't be, unless maybe the role is to process and work through and run simulations. So the reason I'm trying to kind of contrast this slide and the slide right before was to sort of make this point of, I think it's almost too simple to say, is it just brain activity or is it like something meaningful related to our brain's development? It's some like complex interaction of those things. And it's sort of like the level of analysis. Yeah, what layer you're addressing of this phenomena. So the next slide is a video I think it's about 5 or 6 minutes, and it's that Vsauce guy. I don't know if you've seen any of his videos, but he makes pretty cool videos about a lot of things and a lot of psychology related things, and I think he does a really nice job at capturing this idea of dreams. I hope you're enjoying this or having fun. You know, I'm gonna be a little more laid back in this presentation, and you know, it's a Saturday night. It's actually 12:04, a little bit after midnight on a Saturday. I'm drinking coffee. Things are pretty good. I hope you're doing okay. I love doing this class, and all right, let's keep going. Next slide.
Hey, Vsauce, Michael here, and today we are going to talk about why we dream. What's going on inside our brains? The scientific study of dreaming is called onirology, and for most of history it didn't really exist because you can't hold a dream. It's difficult to measure a dream. You can't taste it. You can't see other people's dreams. And if you ask them to tell you what they dreamt, the results are almost always unreliable. In fact, it's estimated that we forget 95% of the dreams we have, especially within the first 10 minutes of having them. But then, in 1952, something amazing happened. Researchers at the University of Chicago found this. It's a unique type of electrical activity that occurs during a certain stage of a person sleeping. When researchers awoke people during this stage, they almost always reported that they had been dreaming. Also, at the same time, during this stage, people's eyeballs are going crazy, rapidly darting all over the place underneath their eyelids. You can actually see this happening if you watch people sleep, like I usually do. During REM sleep, some pretty bizarre stuff happens. If you look at the electrical activity of a brain that is in REM sleep, it almost exactly mimics the way the brain acts when it's awake. The biggest difference being that the production of chemicals inside the brain, like norepinephrine, serotonin, and histamine, is almost completely blocked. And that causes the muscles to stop moving, which is why you can dream about flying or running around or fighting ninjas, but your body doesn't move. People who have a disorder achieving complete REM atopia move around in their sleep and act out their dreams. They can even get out of bed and sleepwalk. Oh, before we move forward, I should say two things. One is that it's possible to wake up and not be able to move your body because you're still in REM atopia. You're completely conscious and you know that you're awake, but your body is not ready to move. On the flip side, you can also be inside a dream and know that you're dreaming. This phenomenon is known as lucid dreaming, and it's particularly attractive because while I'm in a lucid dream, I can make conscious decisions about what I do. I can go fly to wherever I want, or I can have a tea party with Abraham Lincoln. I'm in control, but achieving a lucid dream is quite elusive. Howcast has a great video, which I've put in the description, that gives some tips and tricks on how to achieve one. Researchers were able to deprive mice of REM sleep by using this. Inverted inside a tub of water, way up to the tippy top, meaning that the mouse was only able to sit right on top of this little tiny surface. When that happens, the mouse can still fall into non-REM sleep, but as soon as they reach REM sleep and their muscles relax, they fall off the platform into the water, waking up. What they found was that when mice are not allowed to achieve REM sleep, they have an incredible amount of trouble remembering things. This happens in humans too. If you have people remember word pairs and then you don't allow them to sleep, the next day their memory for that stuff is incredibly terrible. But memory and REM does not stop there. If a person learns a difficult new task during the day, say a new instrument or a new type of difficult puzzle, you can measure the electrical activity in their brain while they do that. And then, while they sleep that night, whether they know it or not, their brain replays those electronic impulses. Many popular theories about why we dream are variations on the idea that while we sleep, the unconscious part of our brain is busy organizing memories and strengthening connections from the day before that we need in the future while getting rid of the junk that would otherwise clog the brain. Now, so the theory goes, these electrical impulses are detected by our conscious brain, and our cortex freaks out and doesn't know what it means, and so it tries its best to create a cohesive story, creating a dream. This would explain why dreams are often so fantastic and seemingly random. They're not supposed to make sense. They're not an actual message from our brain. It's just the results of our cortexes trying to synthesize the noise coming from all the work being done back in the unconscious. Under this way of thinking, dreams are an epiphenomenon. They're not a primary process that has a purpose. Instead, they're the accidental result of a more important process going on behind the conscious brain. But some researchers don't believe that. They believe that dreams serve a primary purpose, and that purpose is to prepare us for threats. They think this because the most prevalent emotions felt during dreams are negative, abandonment, anger, and the most common of all, anxiety. The theory goes like this. Back when we were early humans especially, we had no idea what kind of threats we might encounter during the day. And so, to prepare us, our brain would simulate anxieties while we slept to make us better prepared for that feeling in the real world. So people who had terrifying dreams were better at dealing with anxiety in the real world and had stronger genes. Alright, so the theories we discussed today are quite popular, but they don't really enjoy a consensus. Not everyone agrees on them, and they barely scratch the surface of scientific thought about dreams. But that's kind of the cool thing about dreams. Think of it like this. Here is the Eagle Nebula, a giant structure in outer space 6,500 light years away. But despite its distance, we pretty much know what it's made out of. We know that it's 100 trillion kilometers tall. We know what caused it, and we know where it's going to be in 750 million years. But last night, I had dreams, and no one really knows why or for what reason. And that's pretty cool, and that's why, thanks for watching. If you want to learn more about the world, I highly recommend Smarter Every Day. It's a show here on YouTube by a guy named Destin, who I've met. He's awesome. I've learned a lot from him. He's the guy who did the chicken thing from the lean back. He's also studied what causes poop splash, slow motion water balloons, and has a lot of guns and explosions. What more could you ask for? So do me a favor and go check it out and subscribe if you like it. And if you haven't seen it yet, go check out What's review of my beard. I've got that in the description. And as always, thanks for watching.
In this next segment, I'm going to look at 15 interesting ideas regarding dreams. When you talk about what's interesting about dreams, one of the most fascinating concepts is just that we don't remember them, right? That they're this huge aspect of our cognitive life and our, even, this is kind of interesting too, that people used to think that a lot of your dreams happened in that moment right before you woke up, because they felt that they would only remember, because when you think about it, you only really remember dreams that you wake up during, usually. And so they thought that the dream lived in that like minute or so right before you woke up. We now know that you dream throughout the night, but they kind of thought that that last bit was dream heavy, and you can kind of see how intuitively you would think that. But within about 5 minutes, you've forgotten most of your dream. Within 10 minutes, you've forgotten almost all of it, especially if one of the things we're going to talk about later is you can develop practices of how to remember better and how to actually learn how to not have that deterioration of the memory. And a big thing is not moving right away about and we've all had that, where we've had some powerful dream and then we got up and went to the bathroom or whatever, went back to bed, and what was I even thinking about? And you've totally lost it. It was your whole world 30 seconds ago. So one of the most intense ideas related to this topic of dreaming is just how we don't have the recall of it. And is the reason for that not just chance? Is that the intended role? It's an interesting thing. And then so where you can maybe see where I'm going with that is imagine if in the future you could record it and you could watch it. Are we supposed to is a loaded word, but is that desirable? Why don't we remember it? Is the dream a process of kind of simulations that if we remembered, we would relate differently to than when we don't remember. I don't know if I explained that. I know I explained that kind of in a weird rant, but that's idea number one. So for people that are blind, whether they're born blind or not has an effect on dreaming. And this is, at this point, a lot of this stuff that where I'm saying, like, for example, blind people, or if I say like a certain group of people tend to dream a certain way or whatever, this is just all going to be self-report survey data, right? Because until we can map the visual cortex with computer imagery, basically, the only way we know what people are dreaming about is, well, the best way still is to put people in a sleep lab. As soon as we see that they're in REM sleep, wake them up and ask them what they're dreaming about. But an interesting thing about that is that sometimes you'll wake them up while they're in REM sleep, say, what were you dreaming about? And they'll say, like, I wasn't dreaming. Even when they're doing brain activity that we would associate with dreaming. So they could be, which is kind of mind-blowing, because it's like they're almost having the firing of the dream and not experiencing it sometimes. People who are born blind don't see any images, but have dreams equally vivid, sorry for this squeaking chair, equally vivid, involving other senses of sound, smell, touch, and emotion. So if the person was born blind or not is a significant variable in influencing their experience of the visual aspect of a dream, which is so interesting. It's so complex. Everybody dreams. I touched on this idea earlier that all of us dream. Some of us just don't remember our dreams as much, and there's reasons for that, but except in some extreme situations. So there are reported cases of people that, and it's usually situations of people that have very severe schizophrenic delusional situations that are being heavily medicated, where you could, basically what I'm saying is, if you tried to look in the medical literature about situations of people where they think that they weren't dreaming, those would be the kind of examples of patients in extreme psychological disorder, as it says on the slide. The vast majority of people dream roughly 2 hours a night. There's a massive scale of difference, though, in how much people remember. Now, again, that's kind of assuming a general standard of like 8 hours. So if there's less sleep, then you can expect less dreaming, because dreaming is in cycles, and the longer you're asleep, the richer the dreaming cycles get, and we can talk about that stuff. But you probably dream, and it's about remembering it or not, which is weird, because and this is another thing, it's like dreams, it's such a personal topic, and it's also like a macro topic or whatever, because it affects everybody, but it's so highly personal, because there's a lot of times where I'd wake up in the morning, and if you ask me what I dreamt about last night, I can't remember anything. And the interesting thing is like a lot of it seems to be dependent on when you wake up in the sleep cycle and how close it is to that last dream. Like, it's a pretty interesting concept that everybody dreams it, but there's a huge difference in how, and then you'll meet some people, and it might be a few of you that like remember a lot of your dreams, like almost every day you remember dreams. So that variety and difference in people is an interesting variable. So here's an interesting one, and like a lot of these points, the reason I'm saying these are ideas and not facts is because, first of all, they're really difficult to verify, because a lot of it's self-reported knowledge, and until we can map the visual cortex, and until we can have the recorded, a lot of this is based on reports. But there seems to be this idea that we're not really inventing faces in our dreams. So think about this for a sec, because I think it actually makes sense from the perspective of a lot of other things we've talked about in this developmental psychology course. And when we go all the way back to childhood and how much the child's prioritizing visual-based stimulus, and that like right from the initial recognition of mom, and that this idea that even the myelination around forming like all the neurons around developing the visual system is happening early. It's being prioritized, this visual connection with the world, and that tied to that is this importance of human faces. And originally it's mom's face, but eventually the baby's recognizing and paying more attention to faces than to just general things in the environment. But at the same time, it seems like we don't invent new faces in our dreams. And part of this I think I have is the next slide. Yeah, that throughout our lives we have like thousands and thousands or whatever of faces that we can pull from, because you've seen tons of people, you've watched countless shows. It could be like some extra from some movie you saw sometime, or some person you passed one time in the hall. But it's interesting to think of that idea, because you would almost assume that the idea of creating a unique new face would be relatively easy for your imagination system. But it doesn't seem like that's what we do. It seems like our mind's not inventing faces in our dreams. We see real faces of real people that we've seen during our life, but may not know or remember. So again, like I can't prove that, but it's an interesting idea. So here's a neat concept that not everyone dreams in color. A full 12% of sighted people dream exclusively in black and white. The remaining number dream in full color. Studies from 1915 through the 1950s maintain that the majority of dreams were black and white. But then these results started to change in the 1960s. If we were doing this class live, I'd ask the question here: what do you think might have also happened in the 1960s that made people more likely to have color-based dreams? So you might have guessed this idea, but the emergence of color TV seems to have a big impact on how people dream. And when you think about it from the perspective that watching TV is filled with visual stimulation, that's like one of the main pieces of what we actually call it audio visual, right? Like obviously there's an audio component also, but it's a huge component of, well, you're just adding way more of that type of input. And if the dream is some kind of integration or synthesis or reflection or molding, shaping of that input, changing the content and literally the visual quality of that. It's an interesting idea to say that changing the TV that people watch changed the imagery being represented in dreams. Today, only 4.4% of the dreams of people under 25 are in black and white. Research suggests that those changing results may be linked to this switch from black and white film to more colored media. And if you sort of just simplify it to the argument for that being the case, would be sort of a input-output logic. So this is a topic we're going to come back to big time in a bit when we get into Jung. And this has been one of the big questions always, right? That why did you have this weird dream about an ex, or about this like place that you've never been to, or that you'd love to go, or your favorite vacation place, but it was with like your boss and your in-laws, and it's like some weird I'm just trying to make up an example right in the moment, but you can all think of like a weird dream that you've had. Like, did those things symbolize other things? Like if you dream about some particular subject, one of the ideas is that often the dream's not about that specific thing, that it's actually representing something. I think that actually makes a lot of sense, that if you're having, we'll talk about this and more specifically related to anxiety in a bit, but if you're anxious about something, and then I've had this all the time where I have some dream, I'm anxious about one thing or whatever, and then you have some dream that's like really intense about something that if you were just thinking about consciously, like when you're awake, is ridiculous, right? You're all of a sudden like super stressed. For me, I sometimes have these like weird dreams where I'm going with my friends somewhere and we're going to like an airport or something, and I like don't have my passport, or I don't have my license, or I don't have something that I need to have, and I'm always like finding that out too late. Some of you can probably relate to a dream like that. Do all those things represent something, or is it just a stress dream? Or sometimes it one and sometimes it's the other? And that's one of the reasons I've started this whole presentation with that quote from Carl Jung, because I think it's a good continual reminder that even as we learn more about this and get deeper into it and add layers of understanding, it's important to respect the underlying mystery. There's still this, it's one of the deepest questions about the human mind. Are dreams meaningful, or are they cognitive byproduct? Yeah. The most common emotion experienced in dreams, when you ask people, like, again, this is self-reported data, or self-report survey analysis, that the most common emotion experienced in dreams is anxiety. Negative emotions tend to be more positive, or more common than positive ones. There's an interesting question you could have of that, though. It's oftentimes we remember dreams the most when we're woken up, sometimes even by the dream if it's really negative. So is there more developmental cognitive maturation value in negative emotional dreams than positive? Like, why would it be more negative than positive? Or is it like that related to some of the processing that's happening, and maybe it's important for us to process some of that, like in the kind of Freudian idea of catharsis, that, and I can think of, I mentioned on the last slide that I've had anxiety dreams quite a bit sometimes at different points in my life, and I can remember I sometimes have this dream that I'm on the University of Waterloo campus where I did all my schooling, and I'm always like late for this math class, which is a really weird thing because I never took any math classes at university. Like, the last math class I took would have been in high school. I guess I did some stats stuff, but not actual math. It's like a class that I don't even take. But I have this dream that's like so intense, and you've probably, I'm just trying to give my own version of it, but you've probably had your own highly situated, and that's kind of the interesting thing, that you have your own story of something like this. And if you don't, one of your very close friends does. And the commonality of, well, basically these anxiety dreams that then get contextualized to your own experience, often in kind of unusual ways, but other pressure situations, it's almost like your brain's just running a simulation. It's pretty interesting. And then you wake up a few minutes later and I'm like, go get a glass of water or something and come back to bed, and I'm like all upset or something, and I realize, like, why? I don't even take math. I don't care at all about math class. It's like, I'm like 20 seconds ago it was the whole end of the world, and now it's like, but emotion, it's so emotionally real, right? And this is kind of the point here, is that it's one really important thing in understanding dreams is how there's this undeniable connection between dreams and anxiety, specifically. Dreams and emotions in general, but dreams and anxiety specifically. So I think that people on average dream somewhere between 1 and 2 hours a night, somewhere between 4 and 7 stretches of dream. And that's sort of interesting. It again, the idea I was mentioning before, that like sometimes someone can be in a REM state and you can wake them up and they can report not dreaming. So theoretically, in that dream state, you might not be experiencing dream, you might even be experiencing multiple storyline. But we think that people in general have like 4 to 7 of these segments, and that it can be from 1 to 2 hours. And I think as this is an area of research that's like really kind of current and developing. But just think of that long term. It's like years of your life. 2 hours a day, right? That's what, like, in a month, that's like 60 hours. If you had, imagine if you had 60 hours of footage of just your full HD of your dreams. Right? Because that video I started with, where they were just mapping it with that technology of like the plus signs or whatever, as soon as they can get anything of your visual cortex, as soon as they can even just get you to stare at a plus sign or a minus sign, and they can tell the difference on a thing because they're mapping your visual cortex, it's like the jump from that to full HD is minor. That's just upgrading technology. Once they make that quantum leap of mapping the visual cortex in the lowest definition, doesn't matter at all. It's just going to be a matter of time before that's like 1080p, whatever your phone's best quality is. Kind of a fun one, that animals dream too. Studies have been done on many different animals. They show that they have brain waves that would, and again, this is a scenario where it's like they have brain waves that would signify that they're dreaming. And I've touched on this idea a couple times, but this idea that the brain waves associated with what we think is dreaming aren't 100% of the time experienced as dream. But then again, if any of you have like a dog, for example, you'll sometimes see the dog almost like acting, I don't know what I'm trying to do, but like wiggling around its head and actually like kind of acting out the dream. Watch a dog sleeping, sometimes their paws move like they're running and they make yipping sounds as if they're chasing something. Yeah, so we think like a lot of animals dream, especially a lot of mammals. Here's an interesting one, and here's one of the potential warnings for related to lucid dreaming practices, or people that are like really training to try to get better at remembering dreams. People can have this experience that's called body paralysis, where I'm going to do this in 2 parts. Okay, so the first part is just this idea that you've heard before, like REM, like so that you have this rapid eye movement, and that's when you're dreaming. It's sleep is this normal stage of, REM sleep is this normal stage of sleep characterized by this rapid movement of the eye. REM sleep in an adult typically occupies 20 to 25% of total sleep, about 90 to 120 minutes of sleep a night. Okay, so do you have this like REM stage where you're dreaming? Okay, so just hold that idea for till the next slide. So during this REM sleep that we've been talking about, which you see in this diagram represented by the blue, there's this REM atonia, which is like the idea of your body kind of being paralyzed while you're dreaming. But that biochemical reaction in your body that's causing you to not move your arms can continue after the person's woken up. So what that like literally means is you're lying in bed, you've woken up, but your body is still under the effect of that paralysis. During REM sleep, the body's paralyzed by a mechanism in the brain in order to prevent the body movement, which occurs in the dream, from causing the physical body to move. However, it's possible for this mechanism to be triggered before, during, or after normal sleep while the brain awakens. And I'm going to touch on this a little bit later related to like a potential danger of lucid dreaming, because people that those things are just sort of related. And there's kind of an interesting thing that happens, because sometimes when people And this sounds almost made up until you realize how common the reports of this are. That people that have this body paralysis tend to experience almost like this presence of somebody else in the room, and it's often like a negative spirit. And I'm going to show a video about it, and it seems to be related to how a lot of the stress hormones in the body, and you're in this scenario where you can't move, and so the mind is creating potentially a monster that's not there. It's an interesting idea. I know it sounds a little bit out there, but it's actually not that wild to think that in a paralyzed state your mind would instinctively become afraid of, well, go to a really primal state of fear. And people quite literally report feeling like there's almost like a shadowy figure in the room and being afraid of that. So we'll come back to that concept in a little bit. But that's associated with this thing that's called sleep paralysis. So picture I'm having an awesome dream. I'm like with my friends from high school. We're playing soccer, having a great time. All of a sudden I hear like, what is that? It sounds like Evie's voice. It's like daddy, dad, dad, daddy, daddy. Because Evie's classic thing is like to switch between the two, like daddy, dad, 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 daddy, dad. And all of a sudden I'm like, oh wait, and it starts becoming more and more powerful. It's like at first that sound just got incorporated into my dream, and then if it's intense enough, it'll sometimes actually pull me right out of it. Like if someone's actually shaking your arm, if someone touches your arm quickly, maybe that somehow gets incorporated into the dream. But if it's enough of a stimulation, it can wake you up. And this happens to us all the time. It's why an alarm clock works. And it's also why your alarm clock's not like super rhythmic, and like your phone doesn't, your alarm clock's not like spa music or something that will just keep you asleep. It's like abrasive, right? It's like wah, 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 or whatever, that'll like really wake you up. Sorry, that was a terrible sound effect. But this idea that, what am I really saying? What I'm saying is like your ears are still listening. Your nerve cells in your skin are still experiencing touch. Your eyes are closed, so your vision's limited, definitely. But you're still sensitive to light, which is also why you would wake up when the sun's on you, even though your eyes are closed. Because light obviously passes through the eyelid to some degree. What am I forgetting? Taste. Yeah, so it's like all these senses are still input devices, sensory input devices. And it's almost like if the threshold reaches a certain level, it wakes us. And we're going to talk about that a little later. And Freud has interesting ways of looking at this, and how like even things like turning off the lights and laying under a blanket that regulates us to body temperature. It's like all these things that are ways of almost creating a sensory deprivation experience. And think of what sensory deprivation would mean. It's like the opposite of engaged senses. It's deprived senses. It's trying to limit the sense intake. You like might literally put on a sleep mask and then turn the lights off, and then you might even play like a noise machine to block other noises, and then pull on your blanket to create the touch level sensation of regularization or homeostasis. So it's this interesting, very physical thing. And that this means that sometimes, sorry, it sounds like I have gas or something, but it's that when I rock the chair, it's like the side handle rubs on the table. Sorry about that. If it might not even catch that. But this means that sometimes in our dreams we hear sound from reality, incorporate it into the dream. For example, you may be dreaming that you're at a concert while your brother or roommate's playing guitar, but if that guitar gets like loud enough and abrasive enough, it'll probably wake you up. And again, if you kind of put that in the most practical way, just how many of you wake up with an alarm clock, which is a very strategically placed external stimulus that's timed to wake you up at like whatever, when you need to go to work. So an interesting finding, and this just comes from asking people about the content of their dreams, stopping them and waking them up, and we find that actually women tend to dream, or at least again, this is a self-report, tend to report dreaming about equal numbers of male and female characters in their dream, whereas men tend to report a lot more male characters. And keep in mind that a lot of male dreams also tend to be anxiety related, and so yes, that's just an interesting point. I don't have tons of real like solid research on this. This is all just self-report data, but it's at least kind of interesting that what stresses, because a lot of this comes down to anxiety again, right? So a lot of our dreams are anxious. A lot of men's dreams are about other men, probably often people they work with. I don't know. It'd be interesting to kind of get really deep into why there's any difference at all. That would maybe be an interesting project paper for one of you sometime in the future. Right, and is it related to existence, or I think one interesting question might be, is it related to differences in the experience of anxiety that might exist beyond just in the dream realm? And then how that manifests as anxiety dreams. Yeah, the Freud's like Sigmund and his daughter, who's another giant of psychology, like would have been highly interested in this question of how anxiety is related to dreams. Here's where I always reference the movie Minority Report. If you haven't seen that, it's a classic. It's aged not bad. You might find it a little slow. You might want to just watch like a trailer of the movie. It was Tom Cruise. It was an awesome movie, and basically the premise of the movie is that they were able to, they had these people that I'll explain in a second called precogs, and they were able to predict if people were going to do crimes, and then Tom Cruise's character was like kind of like a police agent who would then go and try to like stop the people committing the crimes, if I'm remembering it correctly. But it was this idea of having a predictive approach to preventing, or preemptively, I meant to say, preventing crime. And the idea in the movie was that there's these group of humans that were, they called them precog, right? Like precognitive. Not, what does precognitive even mean? And it's like, I know what it means, but to describe it, it's actually a really deep concept, because it's almost like thinking without the functional system that we attribute to thinking. It's, what would it mean to have precognitive thinking, right? Because in this course, every time I'm talking about thinking, I'm saying that like at a certain level, thinking and cognitive are almost the same word. So what would precognitive dreams be? And this might reach deep back into our ancient history, and you've heard me comment before that perhaps that like there's good reason to think that we were dreaming before we were speaking. And like, could this be linked to deja vu? It's like something like, what's the stat? There's 70% of people would claim that they've experienced some type of deja vu, and it's like, it almost makes more sense that it's not that we're reliving these glitches in the matrix, it's that we're experiencing things that we've already run the simulation as a dream. Results of several surveys, that's just my opinion sort of, but based on like all the reading I've done on this, results of several surveys across large population sets indicate that between 18 and 38% of people have experienced at least one thing that they would, again, this is like them until we have actual recordings, and that's actually going to get super interesting, right? Because then you actually could prove it. Sorry, I'm not finishing my sentence, but 18 to 38% of people have experienced at least one precognitive dream, and 70% of people have experienced something they'd call deja vu. Like, have you? I bet you if we were doing this live, at least some of you would have a story. Right, and if there's something to be said for this idea I've been hinting at a few times, that maybe what dreaming is running simulations. And maybe a simulation comes pretty close to normal, and it almost like trips us out in the moment because, yeah, did we have a precognitive dream? Did we think of a situation before we had the situation? Did we think about thinking about thinking about thinking? So I kind of like this image of like the person's thought falling into itself, this metacognition idea. So this is kind of interesting, right? Because if you ask people how much they think, like some of the studies that they've kind of done just in popular magazines and stuff, where you ask people like, how many of you believe that you've had a dream that has told you about something, or you experienced something that then happened in your real life after, right? So like the chronological order is important. And those kind of surveys get anywhere from in the 60s to some surveys report as high as 98%. Like, a lot of people have had something like that. Now, at a certain point, you can go a full range of looking at this. Is it just wild coincidence? Is it prophetic? Or like a vision? Or is it the fact that if we're, again, using, not to overuse this word, but if we're running these simulations in our dreams and having like, and all I mean by that is where we're like playing out situations that are close to our real experience, but maybe with like different characters or different situational contexts that are somewhat random, but like the idea of maybe assuming that there's a functional evolutionary reason for dreaming, right? Maybe that the fact that we're running all these simulations, the chances that we then run into a real life situation that's similar to one of the simulations is actually almost something you would expect. Just to finish that point, sorry, that was kind of ranty, but the scientific community on this is undecided. This is a really interesting movie theme, obviously, right? Because it's a thought-provoking concept. You can even think of, some of you may be familiar of the biblical story of like Joseph and the amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. Like, that's a story of precognitive dream analysis. If you're snoring, you're not dreaming. I was like in preparation for this, and I've done presentations similar to this on dreams a lot of times, and so I've come across this idea a lot, but I can't really find any specific studies that have tested this. But if you look at just like sites about interesting facts about dreams, you'll see this everywhere. And I think that the logical connection would probably be that snoring would affect depth of dream state, and affecting depth of dream state might affect likelihood of dreaming. Again, interesting possibility. Couldn't find any specific hard evidence for it. Number 15, you can experience an orgasm in your dreams. You can not only have sex as pleasurable as is real life while dreaming, but also experience an orgasm as strong as a real one without any physical production. Sorry, I didn't know how else to say that. The sensation felt while lucid dreaming, touch, pleasure, etc. can be as pleasurable and as strong as the sensations experienced in the real world. Very limited research in this area. Okay, next slide. Alright, so let's touch on this idea of lucid dreaming that I've hit on a few times, and people tend to get interested in this. And usually when I've talked about dreams with classes live, like at Conestoga, I usually get people, at least one person if it's a decent sized group, and oftentimes several, that report to be lucid dreamers themselves. And for a long time it was interesting because it was considered kind of, well, definitely not scientifically valid until relatively recently, and it's basically been proven to be a real thing. And so, and a lot of us have experienced it at a lighter level. Like, a lot of us have had dreams. Oftentimes, if you're having like a nap in the afternoon on like a summer day, you have this dream that you enjoy, and then you have this, like, you wake up a little bit or something, and then you have this thought of like, I want to fall back asleep and get back into that dream because I was like about to do something cool. And it's like, that's getting pretty close to a lucid dream, where if you're playing kind of any active role at all, right? Like, and that's kind of what's definitional of a lucid dream, where you're exerting cognitive function. You're kind of making executive decisions within the dream. You're not just sort of witnessing it. A lucid dream is a dream in which you know you're dreaming. Typically this happens when the dreamer experiences something strange and they all of a sudden realize, like, why, like, you're not supposed to be alive anymore, and why am I in this country doing this with these people, and like, do my parents know where I am, and like, wasn't I supposed to work today, and like all these kind of weird things that happen when we're dreaming, right? Now sometimes that will, for a lot of us, when we have like a weird dream, that can almost like startle us awake. Yeah, and like lucid dreams happen naturally on occasions, although some people may have them more naturally than others, right? And I'm going to look at some interesting things here about how we can actually see differences in certain activity in brain areas between people that report to be lucid dreamers and not. And it might explain some of this in some of this research from the Max Planck Institute I'm about to show. It's a pretty interesting concept.
Dreams provide a world in which we escape from reality into the mind and seemingly have little control over what happens. But what if you could know you were dreaming and subsequently control the dream? It turns out lucid dreaming is entirely possible, and with a little effort and practice, even you can do it. Now, some of you might be saying, I don't even dream, but the truth is everybody has about 3 to 7 dreams a night. The problem is we quickly forget them. The first strategy towards lucid dreaming is keeping a dream journal. Keeping the journal improves your ability to recall dreams and helps facilitate lucidity. So every time you wake up, write down what you can remember, even if it's nothing, just to form the habit. The next step is performing reality checks. In a dream, something as simple as reading a sentence, counting your fingers, or checking the time can often go astray. Try it right now. Look at the time, look away, and then look back. Assuming you aren't currently dreaming, the time probably stayed the same. However, in a dream, the time or the words you were reading will often completely change. The key is to do these reality checks often when you're awake. This way they become second nature, and when you're dreaming, you're likely to perform the same test and realize that something's wrong. After this comes a technique known as mnemonically induced lucid dreams, or MILD. As you're falling asleep, begin to think of a recent dream and imagine yourself becoming lucid. The idea is to reinforce the intention to realize you're dreaming in your dream. Keep repeating the phrase, I will have a lucid dream tonight. The highest rates of success tend to come if you wake up in the middle of the night, get up for 30 minutes, and then go back to sleep with these intentions in mind. Finally, once you've had success with MILD, an advanced technique known as wake-induced lucid dreams, or WILD, may be attempted. The idea behind this is to keep your mind aware while your body falls asleep. The risk here is that you'll experience sleep paralysis, a completely normal phenomenon that prevents your body from moving during sleep. Except you'll be awake, which can be somewhat frightening. The extra caveat with WILD is that during sleep paralysis, the brain can play tricks on you, inducing strong feelings of fear and causing hallucinations of dark and scary figures approaching you. Scientific research into lucid dreaming has provided an insight into the location of metaconsciousness in the brain, provided opportunities for dream therapy and nightmare recession, and even begged the question if sleep and wakefulness are distinct events or part of a continuum. After all, dreaming of doing something is almost equivalent to actually doing it when looking at the functional system of neuronal activity in your brain. So, are you sure you're not dreaming? Got a burning question you want answered? Ask it in the comments or on Facebook and Twitter, and subscribe for more weekly science videos.
So I had kind of passingly made reference to this earlier, but I wanted to highlight this research that was done at the Max Planck Institute of Human Development, which is kind of this real leader in cutting edge, I don't know if futuristic's the right word, but kind of outside the box, cutting edge would be the word, style of research into things like psychiatry and human development, the Institute for Human Development. Right, it's right in the title. I should have just kind of left it at that, but I want to kind of stress this idea of like the Max Planck Institute is like known for being cutting edge, and they're really interested in this topic of lucid dreaming and how it's related to self-reflection, how it seems that people that are better at self-reflection during waking life seems to be related to lucid dreaming, and it's actually seems to be locatable in certain areas of the brain. Right, so this is to actually isolate it into a specific brain regions that coincide with the experience reported by the lucid dreamers is about as strong of evidence that it's a real thing that we'll get until we actually can record dreams, like we've kind of been saying today. Until we get to that recording dreams, there's going to be a certain speculative element, because a certain piece of it is going to be what people tell us they're dreaming about, right? So there's the self-reporter issue kind of baked into this question of what dreams are. Yeah, so this next little video is going to look into this specific thing a little more deeply.
There's a whole lore about dreaming. In fact, Sigmund Freud wrote a book called The Interpretation of Dreams, which many people think is the foundation of psychoanalysis. Well, scientists now have looked at Freudian psychology and the brain using all these modern techniques. And first of all, we realize that perhaps Sigmund Freud wasn't totally wrong. There are many textbooks which simply dismiss Freudian psychology, calling it nuts. That is nothing but the sexual fantasies of a repressed Venetian scientist of the last century. But now we realize there's more to it. First of all, the unconscious mind. We can actually see the brain in motion. And we realize that much of the activity is totally unconscious, just like what Freud predicted. And Freud also said there is the ego, the id, and the superego, that we are in a constant battle with our desires and our conscious. And we see that now with brain scans. The ego is basically your prefrontal cortex. That is who you are. When you wonder, where am I anyway? Well, you're right there. You are sitting right behind your forehead. And then your desires. We see the pleasure center right there at the center of the brain. That is the libido. We see where the pleasure center is located. And then your conscience is right behind your eyes. The orbital frontal cortex, right behind your eyes, is where your conscious is. And so we actually see that in motion. If you were to see a chocolate cake, you would see these three parts of the brain going zippity back and forth like a ping pong ball, because you're constantly debating the pleasure of eating a chocolate cake versus how fat you're going to become and all the sugar and the calories that you don't really need. So we see the beginnings of Freudian psychology coming out of brain scans. And now, dreams. Freud had a whole collection of interpretation of dreams. Scientists have looked at and said, nonsense. Now we understand the physiology of the dreaming process. And we realize that it comes at the back of the brain, a very primitive part of the brain, and that certain parts of the brain are shut off when you dream. First of all, your prefrontal cortex is basically shut off. It's quiet. Your orbital frontal cortex, that is your conscience, is also shut off. But that part of the brain is your fact checker. The part of the brain that said, that's not right, something's wrong, is right behind your eyes. That's shut off. What is active when you dream is your amygdala. And what does your amygdala govern? Fear and emotions. And so right then you know that when you dream, the active part of the brain is not the fact checker, not the rational brain, it's the emotional brain, the fearful brain that is active when you dream. And then there's some superstition called lucid dreaming, where you can actually control the direction of the dream. Well, that superstition last year became science fact. At the Max Planck Institute in Germany, they were able to show once and for all that lucid dreaming is testable, reproducible, it is real. And here's how they did it. They took a person who was about to go to sleep and told them that when you dream, clench your right fist and then clench your left fist. Now, when you dream, you are paralyzed. You cannot move when you dream. Otherwise, we'd be able to carry out all sorts of horrible things and destroy ourselves. So we are paralyzed when we dream. But when this person went into a dream state, you can clearly see that the brain initiated orders to clench your right fist and your left fist. In other words, he was conscious while he was dreaming. There are many Buddhist texts, many texts hundreds of years old, that give you the outlines of how to control dreams, lucid dreaming. We now know that it's not hogwash, that you can actually do this. You can actually direct the course of your dream. And then one day, we may be able to brain scan the brain as you dream and put it on a screen. In which case, somebody will be able to see you dream and know the direction of the dream, and you are conscious of the process. In other words, the movie Inception is not totally hogwash.
Nightmares. Nightmare is a very distressing dream, right? And that's kind of saying it lightly, especially if any of you experience intense nightmares, that it has this incredible emotional distress associated with it. The dreamer may feel any number of disturbing emotions in a nightmare, such as anger, guilt, sadness, depression, right? Because it's not necessarily a scary thing. It can be an incredibly sad thing or a traumatic thing. Common fears or feelings are fear and anxiety. Nightmare themes vary widely from person to person from time to time, and even for any one person in their own life, what they have nightmares about can have repetitiveness, but can also be very different. And one of the most common themes is being chased in some form or the other. Another really common thing is like that feeling of being chased and also not being able to respond how you would like all of a sudden you can't run. It's like you're playing some sport game and it's an important moment. I would have this and I'm like trying to run down the field and I get like all of a sudden I just can't run. It's like, where's that come from? It's like some like deep-seated worry about like how this relates to like threat detection is so interesting, I think. Now, one really fascinating idea is that kids tend to have nightmares about like made up monsters, some kind of like fantasy figure, or like, you know, like the boogeyman in the closet. Whereas adults tend to have nightmares about other adults. There's a sadness there. It's almost like as we get older, we realize that sometimes like the biggest threat is like other humans, not made up monsters. So it's interesting how that actually affects the content of basically, you know, the bad guy in the dream or the bad figure. But often the bad guy, literally, right? Because oftentimes, as it says there, adults commonly are chased by an unknown male figure. Showing this picture because it kind of shows this interesting, well, it's just a comic, right? Like the brain saying, let me get this straight, you're mad because of the bad dream, and the heart saying, like, that doesn't sound like an apology, like, that was tough on me. And it's like, we have very real emotions associated with these simulations, I'm calling them, right? Or these dreams. So we have these dreams that feel so real. And we feel such real upset. And a lot of us have probably had that, where you have like a really bad dream and then you wake up and it's almost hard to just like go have your day, because it's like you're kind of carrying that upsetness, emotional energy forward with you. It's one of the interesting dynamics is this relationship between cognition and emotion in relation to the dream experience. Right? Because so often that emotion in the dream is an anxious or a fear-based emotion. An interesting point about Freud, and I've probably touched on this at some point in our courses together before, but just to hit it quickly, is that it's not like he developed this idea about dreams philosophically and then tried to apply it to his patients in that kind of top-down way. He was a medical doctor, and people were coming to him talking about these things that, you know, now we would kind of classify under certain branches of mental health issues, and at the time were conditions not easily determined by specific known causes, right? And so he was, and this is kind of where the idea of the unconscious comes from. It's like that there's something more going on than this person's able to tell me. It's almost like has to be stuff going on behind the scenes. What does behind the scenes mean when we're talking about someone's mind? Behind the scenes means an unconscious mind, a mind that you're not aware of, bottom part of that iceberg. And that, so then what Freud started to notice is that when he would be working with these people, they would want to tell him about their dreams. They'd be like, okay, well, I just, because he would have them, sorry, I'm jumping all around, but another Freudian technique is what he would call free association. So he would have them sit on that couch, the classic Freudian couch, and he would sit out of their sight so that his responses didn't affect them, and he would have them talk or free associate, which just meant basically just say whatever comes to mind, just freely associate. You don't have to tell a structured, logical story, just say what you think of. And what he found is a lot of people would tell him about their dreams. And he started to realize, like, first of all, the story of dreams is interesting. It's also interesting to have people interpret what they think the dream is, because it gives you glimpses into more of an unfiltered expression of their unconscious. Like he called it the royal road to the unconscious, meaning like that's like the king's road. That's like the best, not only the best way, it's like the way the king would take. Just to overuse the word royal road, right? It means like it's the cleanest route to the unconscious. Cleanest route, that's not what I want to say. the most direct, unfiltered route. Right? And so he thought things like desires and aggressions and stuff would surface more in a dream because they're not being repressed by the superego, basically, in Freudian language. Or our worry, in modern language, our worry of like how other people will view us and weighing consequences, basically. So let's look at what Freud had to say. With his psychoanalysis, Sigmund Freud opened the door for dreams to become a subject of scientific research, right? The interpretation of dreams, that's like 1899. Freud became interested in dreams when dealing with his patients because they were telling him their dreams spontaneously, which is sort of what I was saying, that he started to then eventually start to ask about it and started to include it, interpreting dreams, as one of his sort of therapeutic tools. Right? And this is a kind of not often talked about part about Freud too, is that he was big into hypnosis, and then that free association idea that I described on the last slide. So like dream interpretation, free association, hypnosis to get to a relaxed state, to break down some of those common defense mechanisms, were kind of core aspects of early, well, and remember, it's not like he's almost inventing or developing this idea of psychoanalytic intervention. This idea, so Freud goes into this idea of a subconscious. So I'll just read this. In the end of the 19th century, Freud started researching this idea of like the mechanisms of dreaming. Like what is actually, think of mechanisms as meaning like the mechanics, like how does an engine actually work? Like what's actually happening when you're dreaming? Not just that they're kind of interesting and cool, but like some of the questions we're trying to answer, or at least address or touch on in this presentation. The analysis of dreams became indispensable as a tool for therapy for the psychoanalyst since then. And for Freud, dreams were, I'm kind of reading this out of order, but dreams are understood as this like key thing to understand what is subconscious, or what is this like. And subconscious is this new word that starts to emerge in his writings. It's like not unconscious, not conscious. Is there almost like a part of that iceberg that's like touching the water but not under the water? Is that where dreams are? Is that why they sometimes bring up parts from the, why they're sometimes wet with parts from the water? I'm trying to overuse the iceberg metaphor, but like, is that why sometimes it glimpses into the unconscious? So how Freud talks about this, and we're going to see a major contrast, right? So you can see Freud talk about it as very like physical psychological, and see Jung talk about it as very like spiritual psychological almost, or psychophysical Freud, psychospiritual Jung. Freud's ideas regarding dreams, you can almost view this as being very similar to the idea of sensory deprivation, that we get tired. So your brain basically gets tired from doing things all day, receiving stimulus, seeing things, engaging, thinking. You know, at the end of the day, we try to fall asleep. A main characteristic of the psychical, or like the psychological experience state of the sleeper, is therefore a withdrawal from reality, right? So it's like, he's kind of talking about this at a kind of overview level, that what's happening as a organism is that you basically get tired out, and you have to withdraw from your interaction with the world and go into this sleep state to kind of recharge your battery and then re-enter. And it requires this withdrawal from reality, this cessation, or this stopping of taking interest in the outside world, right? Closing your eyes, putting a blanket over you so you don't feel the wind. We try to fall asleep by disconnecting from sources of external stimuli, right? So the more modern way of saying that is like by trying to apply sensory deprivation, or try to limit the things that wake us back up. Keep going with this idea. It's like we lay down in a silent, dark room, cover our body to keep it comfortably warm, to minimize input from the environment. Of course, an absolute withdrawal would not be possible. We wouldn't want to have like, although sometimes we probably feel like when we can't fall asleep, it'd be nice to just have an on-off switch, but there's obviously that is impossible. And also, like, Freud makes the point of like, what would happen if you couldn't switch back on? right? It's like, that's just not our biology. In other words, there's this weird transition point, and it's best understood as a transition between states, not a binary sleep-awake, in the sense of like on-off, that it's more fluid and it's a sleep state. Sorry, here's kind of the place where he fills out that idea I was mentioning, that after all, if such an absolute withdrawal was possible to achieve, the sleeper would risk not waking up again, since more and more strong stimuli in the morning are exactly what wakes us up, right? Like the alarm clock, the light. These stimulus disturb us also during sleep, and mentally we're trying to resist their influence on us, creating a dream. That's what Freud thought. That it was, although you were trying to deprive, that you're basically incorporating dream incorporation idea from before, that's whatever was coming in was somehow getting incorporated, processed. These stimuli disrupt us or disturb us also during sleep, and our mentality is forced to respond to them with dreams. So before we move into looking at Jung's idea, I wanted to touch on this notion that Jung also presented, and this is an idea that I used to, when I was in my kind of 20s, found so fascinating, his concept of active imagination, and that you could almost have, create these rich psychological, visionary almost experiences as this like cognitive journey, as this kind of advanced daydreaming almost, and he called this active imagination. And if you ever, I'm just going to kind of touch on it now, and actually in the next course I want to go in deeper into what he meant by this. But if that's something that interests you, I would throw that into Google, just what does this word active imagination mean? And you can kind of imagine, right, that we actually have the ability to get highly creative in our daydreaming and in our ability to create these mental constructions, these mental operations, these active imaginations. And it's almost this like awake dreaming. That's like a kind of classic picture. This is a cool piece of art, whoever made this. It's like a kind of classic picture of Carl Jung smoking his pipe, and it's like the universe is coming out of it. You can see like the stars within him too. It's pretty cool. Alright, so let's get into Carl Jung. This is about to, hopefully you'll find this is about to get pretty interesting, because he believes in this deep symbolic depth to the dream, and that it's deeply linked with our kind of mythical or religious or spiritual and ancestors and consciousness, and how all these things are expressions of mind, layers of mind, right? Carl Jung, I'm working on this here. I want to just show you this quick. I didn't even mean to, but I have it right here. Sorry if that sounded really loud. But a couple of the things I'm working on for our next presentation. So this is a book that's really interesting, but it's actually by a really awesome author called Colin Wilson. Colin Wilson wrote a book called The Outsider, which is a classic. But this one, Carl Jung, Lord of the Underworld, active imagination. This one, Carl Jung, The Four Archetypes, it's a key one. And then, this one, as you can kind of see, is what I'm working on for our presentation. I even got some cue cards going. But The Portable Jung is an awesome book, because this is a collection of like all of his main lectures, like different personality types, phenomenology of self, the relationship between ego and unconscious, which is what I was looking at, the structure of the psyche, the stages of life. Just to give you an idea, dream symbolism in relation to alchemy, that's a pretty decent title chapter name. The spiritual problem of modern man, Eastern and Western thinking. See, if you look at this, it's like all highlighted up. Like this was I took a course on Carl Jung's theories of religion as like a 4th year seminar when I was in university, and it was like one of my favorite classes ever. I want to share some of that, because there's a lot of wisdom in that book. Like because sometimes we touch over in these psychology classes, we'll be like, oh yeah, Carl Jung, he was like a student of Freud, he had some weird idea about the collective unconscious, and then we move on to the next person, and it's like, whoa, that's not nearly enough time. This book was edited also, I should say, by Joseph Campbell, like one of the most interesting religious scholars of all time. All right, so yeah, active imagination, that's a cool word to Google. Now we're going to take a Jungian look at understanding dreams, right, and how this kind of fits into his broader approach to what would later be called analytic psychology, right, his branch of depth psychology. And the book on the bottom there, Memories, Dreams, and Reflections, awesome book. That's another classic Carl Jung book. All right, so we're going to switch from Freud to Jung here. Although I know the last slide was the active imagination, but now we're going to look specifically about what he has to say about dreams. It's actually something talked about in this book, Memories, Dreams, and Reflections, but that one of the things that actually led to the downfall of the relationship between Jung and Freud, and remember, like, Jung was Freud's prize student, was this disagreement over the essence of the unconscious. They both believed in it. Freud thought it was more of this animalistic, instinctual, sexual, aggressive thing, and Jung thought it was, well, I say they're like more spiritual, but he has this really deep idea of what a collective unconscious would be, or what, that there's this like mythical past that we have. And if you read some of the letters around the breakup of their relationship, you see that, or like the breakup of their professional relationship, you see that like Freud continually warning Jung not to go down that path of mythology, to not lose the psychosexual model. And that's really what drove this wedge. Yeah, it's fascinating to see, because those letters exist and you can read those letters, and even the language in the letters gets sharper as it goes on. And Freud was worried that Jung was going to get lost into the occult and get lost down into like and lose what Freud thought was the essential genetic biological core of the unconscious. So it's kind of interesting that those two incredible minds, their argument was over what the unconscious is. So here's an important point to understanding Jung. According to Jung, dreams are a way of communicating and equating yourself with the unconscious. Of communicating with it and equating, meaning like getting to know it. That dreams are not attempts to conceal your true feelings from the waking mind, but rather they're a window to the unconscious. They serve to guide the waking self to achieve wholeness and offer a solution to problems you're facing in your waking life. So Jung was encouraging a much more active engagement with the dreaming part of mind, layer of mind, because he saw that as this essential potential pathway between the conscious and the unconscious that potentially was linked with this huge transformative potential in people. We know the mask of the unconscious is not rigid. It reflects the face we turn towards it. That'd be kind of kind of outside the box, but an interesting assignment to just give you that quote and ask you to tell me what that means to you. Right? Like, I'm not going to do, like, just as a thought experiment, like, what would that mean? That our unconscious has some kind of fluidity, that it somehow is engaging us in a personalized way, that it's reflecting what's being turned towards it. It's some kind of complex interplay. Right, so he's deeply fascinated with the mystery of it, the mystery the dream plays in giving us glimpses to otherwise unattainable aspects of the unconscious mind. And not just like ideas or memories or energies or whatever that are in the unconscious, but also that you can change your relationship to your own unconscious. It's part of the kind of Jungian foundational concepts. So the 4 functions of dreams. So if you ask, so this is Jung's idea, and remember, function meaning like why we do it, like what's the use of it. I like this first point because this is like one of Jung's specific points, and it's one of those things that you could copy pretty quick onto your page, but if you really break down, it's really saying the dreams do basically everything. They develop, they maintain, they regulate, and they restore your psyche. But not just your psyche, like all the actual structures of your psyche, the processes of your mind or psyche, how it's organized. It develops, so you can apply each of the blue words to each of the green things specifically. So the development of the processes of your mind and the maintenance of those processes, and how they're regulated and balanced, and how they're restored when there's problems, and that's also true at a structural level and at an organizational level. So like core to that idea we talked about really early, that it's maybe a core piece of cognitive and cognitive development and maturation, that it seems to help us compensate and balance a lopsided psyche, that maybe we're experiencing high levels of stress and then we have these stress dreams, and there's some kind of balancing effect happening, a compensating balancing effect, that dreams actually can function or serve the role of creating a pathway for dialogue with the unconscious through interpretation of dreams is going to be the next step that he would say to finish that sentence, and that understanding and maybe changing how we stand in relation to this dream content and incorporating it into our understanding of self can potentially enhance quality and meaning in our personal lives, would have been his idea, right? That there's like a real cognitive psychological development benefit associated with engaging in this process actively. So Jung believed that by the time if someone was to live to 75 years old, they would have spent roughly 50,000 hours dreaming, which would be roughly 6 years of their life. Right, and whether that's like, I'm sure that more current studies of it would give slightly different numbers, but like just roughly, like if you just let your mind kind of think about that, 6 years of your life are being spent in this dream state. That to Jung, that point alone almost, like whether it's 6 years or 6.5 or 7 or even 8 or 5, it's like this idea that you're spending years of your life in this visual experience seems to be evidence that nature has deemed this necessary for some reason, and that it's based on this belief that dreams are helpful and meaningful, and not just these nonsensical meanderings of sleep, not just this random, activity synthesis byproduct. Although that incorporation and that activity synthesis is a piece of it, one of Jung's points is that this seems to be a core piece of even things like the development of culture and language and archetype, which is one of his big words, which means like a type that is so essential and so true that it's the foundation of types. If we say there's different types of people, it's like, well, okay, what are heroes like? And we can kind of distill down what are the core points of a hero. And, Jung would do this with different things, and quite literally one of his ideas was the hero archetype or the mother archetype or the trickster. The tyrannical king and the loving father, right? So there's always the dichotomy, the consuming mother and the loving mother, the trickster and the hero. That, Jung thought that like there's something going on here. There's just something going on here, and this thing that's going on seems to be a central factor in the development of our conscious mind and just our lives. It is characteristic that a dream never expresses itself in a logically abstract way, but always in the language of a parable or simile. This particularity is also a characteristic feature of primitive languages. Just as the body bears traces of phylogenetic development, so does the human mind. Phylogenetic development, like showing how we eventually, like opposable thumbs or something, how physical development, that's true for the mind too. Hence, there's nothing surprising about the possibility that figurative language of dreams is a survival from an archaic, ancient mode of thought. A dream mind. I added that part, obviously, but it's interesting. And his idea here is that it stretches deep into the history of our Homo sapiens species. To Jung, the dream experience was like a classical play. It had an introduction, it had this like rising build-up of activity, this rising action, it had this climax or this end scene, and that it could almost be understood as almost like an episode of something. The last sentence of a dream, Jung thought, was highly important. What was the last thing that you heard someone say in that dream? And he put significance on that last piece of like dialogue. He thought that one of the reasons why sometimes it feels like we're having similar dreams is that some dreams can exist in almost as part of a series. And he thought that that was one of the advantages of recording whatever dreams, memories you have, because it could help you over the long period of time start to see connections you didn't notice, these things he called slender threads between things, these little threads of commonality between seemingly different dreams. So one of Jung's big points was that to understand a dream and to interpret a dream correctly, we have to understand associations and the associations we're making in our dreams. He thought that we can look at the dream as if it's a play or a drama, to see it as a whole event, to see it as a narrative script, to see what the associations, because what he also meant by this is that he was also interested in what that meant to the person, to the dreamer. Like you saw, you know, your ex or an old boss, or you felt stressed because you're in the presence of, you know, some person or something, and what did that mean to you? What are the associations that you think about, that you feel, that you intuit? That it's not specific free association, it's this idea of trying to, it's the opposite almost of free association. It's like heavily charged strategic association. The idea is that you stick with the image and make associations with them. That these associations, or, you know, these connections between dreams and what they might mean, should be thought about as highly personalized. Right, so Jung would be a big supporter of like writing out dreams and trying to notice the patterns and trying to see what kind of personalized narratives are being acted out in these dramatic visual experiences. Another of Jung's techniques was to use this idea called amplification to try to interpret a dream and to look at, say, for example, you've heard me a lot today talk about anxiety. Like, what role did anxiety play as a narrative theme in this dream? And trying to build it up a little bit, expand on it, stretch it out, move it, but stay with that idea, that image. So when we start to get into symbols and archetypes and themes, and where Jung would see these connections to myths. When we work with dreams, we begin to learn the language of dreams. Yes, we had this word amplification. And Jung said that after doing that association and amplification, we try to look for the turning point in the dream. This, like, if it was a TV show, like the main point, the main kind of thing that they're covering in that episode, the main crisis point. It's often the point in the dream that stands out the most, catches your attention, draws your curiosity. What was the essential heart of that dream? So kind of this idea of association, amplification, determining crisis, as if you're almost exploring as a detective the dream content. So Jung's final points. So these are some kind of just additional points I wanted to say about what he would say about if people are interested in doing this themselves, to pay attention to the place of the dream, the situation, the buildings, the landscapes, any details you can remember. Look at the qualities of the people, the animals involved, because what you're going to be wanting to do is over time notice similarities and patterns and repetition. What are the belief system? This is so deep. It's like, if you had to look into how you were responding to things in your dream, what would you say the belief system of that character you were representing in your dream was? What's the belief system displayed by the dream ego? Look at the behavior of the different images and themes in that dream. What role did anxiety play? What role did fear play? What role did desire play? What role did guilt play? Are there things that keep showing up in these dreams? Is it like a house from your childhood, or is it always by water, or is it always at nighttime? What kind of emotions and mood and atmosphere is associated with it? Was there this feeling of anticipation or this feeling of dread? It just says under my video here, under the dream environment. Right? Are there, and again, this gets actually interesting. He actually went really deep with this and did a whole thing that's called his Red Book, where he went deep into analyzing through art and through reflection his own dreams. And it got him really interested in things like geometry, or some of the visual shapes that he was experiencing in his dreams. The kind of sacred geometry, he would talk about it as. Like, were there colors? You're just looking for patterns, basically. So when you're interpreting, Jung thought that, okay, so once you've created this, once you've kind of worked to deepen your memory around the dream and kind of branch out this dream environment and identify these images as part of the psyche, that he would say that once you've kind of understood that, then you can begin the process of like, what does this mean to my actual life? And Jung thought that often your dream was connected to something within the last couple days, 2 to 3 days. And he thought that finding that context is an important aspect of involving dream interpretation in any kind of meaningful psychological growth process. That it's only one thing to understand the dream, but understand what that means for you specifically, and how to integrate that to Jung was highly important. Jung believed that integrating these dreams and integrating these aspects of the unconscious that are being represented through the imagery and the archetypes of the dreams, that can help us develop a sense of inner life. Sorry if you hear some noise in the background. We're now Sunday morning. My daughter's in the background here watching a video, but she has headphones on. She's being perfect right now. So if you hear any noise, that's what that is. That Jung thought that getting involved in this dream interpretation process can help us expand our consciousness and help us become more comfortable with the complexities of our own personal life. And that this idea of conversing with these dream images is Jung's concept of active imagination, or this high content focused visualization exercise. In sleep, fantasy takes the form of dreams. But in waking life too, we continue to dream beneath the threshold of consciousness, especially when under the influence of repressed or other unconscious complexes. The great Carl Gustav Jung. Hope you enjoyed this presentation. I had fun doing it. I know it's a little bit different. I tried to have a little bit more fun with this and just be a little bit less notes based and a little bit more discussion, philosophical or whatever. So anyways, I meant to have this about an hour and I'm getting closer to 2, so I'm going to cut this off. But again, I really enjoy this class. I hope that you get something out of it, and we have one presentation left. Right, we're going to get into Jung and Frankl, and this idea of transformation of self. All right, catch you next week. Mark's coming soon. I know that I'm taking forever for that. That's my goal for today and tomorrow. So we'll get to that to you soon. And again, thanks for being such an awesome group in class. And if you need anything, please reach out. All right, take care. That was Dreams. I hope you enjoyed it. And next time we're going to be getting into, deep into Frankl and Jung and this idea of, Jung's idea of ion, or the difference between ego and self, and then Frankl's idea of the will to meaning. And so many pages. I showed you the Jung books, and it's like, sorry for all that extra noise I knocked over the phone, but this is the Frankl book we're going to be looking at, the will to meaning. Cheers. Take care.